What if I told you that a tiny Caribbean island of just 50,000 people is basically dismantling everything we think we know about global human development?
I mean, it's pretty wild to look at the numbers.
Right. I want you to picture this. Geographically isolated, extremely limited natural resources. No massive oil reserves, no sprawling industrial complexes.
Yeah, none of the usual stuff.
Exactly. And yet this specific community is consistently outperforming the world's most massive superpowers in the metrics that actually define a high quality of life.
It completely upends the traditional geopolitical playbook.
It really does.
We are just so conditioned to associate societal success with sheer scale and, massive economic footprints.
We always think of scale, don't we? Like, we
Yeah.
assume that to have world-class development, you need massive tax bases, endless land masses, diverse resources.
Right, economies of scale that can fund those huge social safety nets.
Exactly. But today, we're doing a deep dive into a really dense, multidimensional stack of United Nations data.
Oh yeah, lots of spreadsheets.
So many spreadsheets. We're looking at the Human Development Index, the Gender Development Index, inequality metrics, planetary pressures, stretching all the way from 1990 to 2023.
And all of this rigorous, peer-reviewed data points straight to this tiny jewel island nation, Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Right. And the mission of this deep dive is to basically figure out the exact statistical engines driving this nation. We're going to extract the core insights here to understand how a microeconomy achieves what we're calling a macro impact.
Which is a fascinating premise.
Is their success the result of some disproportionate educational investment? Is it a unique gender dynamic? Or just pure economic leverage? Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the absolute baseline.
Yeah, the macro view of where they actually stand.
Right.
So the foundational metric here is the Human Development Index, or HDI. And just to frame this for anyone who, hasn't stared at UN data all day.
Of course, most people, probably.
Yes, thankfully. The HDI was created specifically to counter the idea that a country's success can be measured entirely by its gross domestic product.
Right, it's not just about money.
Exactly. It's a composite score built on three vital pillars.
Mm-hmm.
So that's living a long and healthy life, having access to knowledge, and enjoying a decent standard of living.
Okay.
And it generates a score between 0 and 1. So in 2023, the global average HGI stood at 0.756.
0.756 for the entire world, a sort of global middle ground. So where does our island giant sit on that spectrum?
Well, Saint Kitts and Nevis achieved an incredibly impressive 0.840 in 2023.
0.840. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that isn't just a marginal bump. That pushes them firmly into what the UN categorizes as the very high human development tier.
They're outperforming the global average by roughly 11.1%.
That's significant.
It really is. To put that in perspective, out of the 203 countries and territories ranged globally, Saint Kitts and Nevis sits at number 59.
Number 59, with 50,000 people.
Right. That places them comfortably in the top 29.1% of the entire globe. And it's crucial to note the trajectory here, too.
Because it didn't just happen overnight.
No, not at all. This isn't a sudden spike caused by some one-off foreign investment or a glitch. Back in 2005, their HDI was 0.758.
Okay.
So they've maintained this remarkably steady, deliberate climb. They even hit a peak global rank of 54 back in 2014.
I'm looking at these rankings, and my immediate instinct is to think about logistics.
How so?
Well, if you only have 50,000 citizens, you really only need to build a handful of state-of-the-art hospitals. You only need to fund one concentrated school district.
Right, the density argument.
Yeah, you don't have to string infrastructure across thousands of miles of hostile terrain.
So is this high HDI just a statistical quirk of being small? Is it just fundamentally easier to manage a micro-population?
See, what's fascinating here is that we intuitively conflate smallness with ease of management.
It feels logical. It does. But in macroeconomics and geopolitics, smallness is almost always synonymous with extreme vulnerability.
Vulnerability in what sense? Lacking a buffer zone.
Think about the mechanics of a national economy.
Yeah.
If you have 50,000 people, you possess essentially zero internal market.
Oh, right.
A massive country can weather a global trade collapse because its citizens can just buy things for each other.
They have domestic demand.
Exactly. Saint Kitts and Nevis cannot do that. They are intensely vulnerable to global market shifts, supply chain disruptions, and, the fluctuating price of imported goods.
Because everything has to be brought in.
Pretty much. And furthermore, in the Caribbean, You have the ever-present existential threat of natural disasters.
Right, hurricanes.
A single Category 5 hurricane can wipe out a double-digit percentage of a small island's GDP, literally overnight. Your entire agricultural sector and tourism infrastructure can just be dismantled in 12 hours.
Wow. So when you look at that steady upward trajectory from 2005 to 2023, you aren't seeing a country just taking it easy on tutorial mode.
Not at all.
You're seeing a system absorbing massive external shocks and continuing to climb anyway.
It's a marker of profound systemic resilience. It proves that sheer landmass and endless populations aren't prerequisites for engineering a high quality of life. They've built shock absorbers into their society.
And if the HDI is built on those three pillars you mentioned earlier, health, wealth, and education, we need to identify which pillar is serving as that primary shock absorber.
Yeah, which one is doing the heavy lifting?
Because when I dig into this UN data stack, one specific area absolutely leaps off the page: the educational metrics.
Oh, absolutely.
The way the society treats the classroom is just staggering compared to the global baseline.
The education data is really where the narrative of Saint Kitts and Nevis begins to completely diverge from the rest of the planet.
Let's look at the expected years of schooling, the EYS.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, this is the metric that tracks the total number of years a child entering the education system can statistically expect to stay in it.
Yeah.
In 2023, the global average is roughly 13 years. 13.0 to be exact.
Which perfectly aligns with a standard developmental model. You start primary school around age 5, you move through secondary education, and you graduate high school around 18.
Right, 13 years.
The global system is essentially designed with the expectation that a citizen will finish high school and immediately enter the workforce.
But in Saint Kitts and Nevis, the expected years of schooling for 2023 isn't 13. It is 18.4 years.
Yeah.
We are talking about a 5.4-year gap between this island nation and the rest of the world.
It's massive.
I really want you to think about what that means mechanically for a human life. An extra 5.5 years of formal education doesn't just mean you took a few extra electives.
No, not at all.
That represents an entire undergraduate degree and a significant push into a master's program or, highly specialized vocational training.
And that is the societal baseline expectation. A child entering the school system there is statistically projected to receive extensive tertiary education.
It's just expected.
Right. We also see this validated in the mean years of schooling metric, which tracks the actual time spent in classrooms by adults over 25.
Yeah.
Globally, that number sits at about 8.7 years.
Okay.
But in St. Kitts and Nevis, it's approaching 11 years.
So it kind of functions like societal compound interest. The global average prepares a student for basic workforce entry, like manufacturing, agriculture, entry-level retail.
Exactly.
But the educational timeline in St. Kitts and Nevis is aggressively preparing its citizens for hyper-specialized, advanced roles.
And this is the architectural blueprint for how a resource-limited island pivots its entire economic destiny.
How do you mean?
Well, when you don't have massive reserves of timber or oil or vast tracts of arable land for industrial agriculture, your options for global trade are severely limited.
You can't just export raw materials.
Right. So what becomes your most valuable export? What is your economic moat? It has to be human capital. It is the cognitive capacity of your citizens. By engineering a highly educated workforce, they're deliberately transitioning away from physical labor dependencies and leapfrogging straight into a service, information, and knowledge-based economy.
But, sweeping averages can hide the most interesting stories. When we break apart that 18.4-year educational average, we find a demographic asymmetry hiding inside the numbers that completely blew my mind.
You're looking at the gender breakdown.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We've spent the last 30 years listening to global campaigns about closing the gender gap.
Right.
And the UN's Gender Development Index, the GDI, shows the world slowly, painfully inching toward parity. It crept from 0.908 in 1993 up to 0.955 in 2023.
It's very slow progress globally.
Exactly. But in St. Kitts and Nevis, equality isn't the story. It's an aggressive inversion of the historical norm. As of 2023, the expected years of schooling for females in this country is 19.7 years.
It's incredible.
Let that sink in. Nearly 2 decades of expected schooling for women. Meanwhile, for males, the expectation is 17.0 years.
A 2.7-year inverted gap. Women are not just catching up. They are receiving significantly more advanced education than men.
They really are.
They are the statistical engine driving that massive national average we just talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the mean years of schooling for women there, it jumped from 8.5 years in 2005 to 11.1 years in 2023.
Wait, if women are spending almost 20 years in the academic system, doesn't that fundamentally fracture the labor market?
How so?
Well, if the women are all getting master's degrees, who is running the day-to-day foundational economy? Are the men being structurally left behind to handle the manual or entry-level sectors? Is this like a new brand of inequality?
That's the natural fear when you see a gap that wide. But you really have to contextualize the male baseline here.
Okay.
The men in Saint Kitts and Nevis are at 17 expected years of schooling. Remember, the global average for men is hovering around 13 years.
Oh, right.
So, the men on this island are still outpacing the global average by 4 entire years. They are highly educated by any international standard. It is definitively a rising tide lifting all boats.
So the entire society is highly educated, but the women are just pushing into hyper-advanced, specialized academic territories.
It creates a fascinating sociological dynamic.
Yeah.
When you have a society where women are spending a third of their lives in advanced education, you trigger immense downstream effects across the entire cultural fabric.
Like, what's the ripple effect?
Well, think about the mechanics of family planning. The data consistently shows a known correlate globally. As female education years rise, adolescent birth rates plummet.
Which makes sense.
Right. Women are in the classroom, they're securing advanced degrees, entering specialized career fields, and logically, they're delaying starting families. You are completely reshaping the traditional timeline of female adulthood.
And we actually see that in the data, right? The adolescent birth rate in Saint Kitts and Nevis dropped massively from 55.5 in 1990 down to 35.1 in 2023.
Right.
Whereas the global average is still up at 39, so they've dropped well below the world average there.
It's a textbook demographic transition driven by education.
And it doesn't start at family planning. You can't have a demographic that holds the vast majority of advanced degrees without that translating into systemic power.
Oh, definitely not.
If the women possess the hyper-specialized knowledge, they inevitably start taking the leadership roles in that knowledge-based economy we talked about. They become the administrators, the policy drafters, the financial leaders, and ultimately the political vanguard of the nation.
And this is where the political data is just phenomenal. If you look at the percentage of parliamentary seats held by women in Saint Kitts and Nevis, it was at just 6.67% back in 2014.
Barely anything.
Right. But by 2023, it exploded to 31.25%.
Wow. From under 7 to over 31% in less than a decade.
Yeah. And just for context, the global average for female parliament seats in 2023 was only 26.5%.
So they completely bypassed the global average.
They did. It fundamentally alters the architecture of governance. You transition from a traditionally male-dominated power structure to one where the intellectual capital, and therefore the political leverage, is heavily concentrated in the female population.
It's a phenomenal real-world example of how supercharging female education serves as the ultimate catalyst for broader human development.
Absolutely.
So we have this picture of an incredibly educated society, nearly 20 years of schooling for women, 17 for men, a workforce primed for a high-level service economy.
Right.
But 20 years in a classroom doesn't magically feed a population. You can have a PhD, but if your local economy can't absorb that highly specialized talent, you just end up with massive brain drain.
People just take their degrees and leave.
Exactly. How is this island actually converting those diplomas into spendable capital and physical health?
Well, we have to shift our focus to the financial and health pillars of the HDI. Let's look at the gross national income, or GNI, per capita. This gives us the hard economic reality on the ground. In 2023, the GNI per capita in Saint Kitts and Nevis was roughly $29,105.
$29,000 per person.
Now, compare that to the global average GNI per capita for the same year, which was just over $20,300.
That's way ahead.
Saint Kitts and Nevis is outperforming the global economic average by roughly 43%.
That is a staggering economic engine for 50,000 people. And logically, that high income provides the vital tax base necessary to fund the very schools and universities we were just talking about.
Right, it's a feedback loop.
It creates a closed-loop system, yeah. Invest in education, build a service economy, generate high GNI, tax it, and pump it right back into the schools.
It is a highly effective loop, but it isn't frictionless. And this brings us back to the inherent vulnerability of small island states we discussed earlier.
The vulnerability to shocks.
Exactly. That high wealth generation is heavily reliant on global connectivity. If we look closely at their economic timeline, their GNI per capita was actually higher before the pandemic.
Right.
But in 2020, it suffered a massive contraction.
Right.
It dropped all the way down to roughly $25,500.
A drop of several $1,000s per person in a single fiscal year. That is a brutal economic shockwave.
When global travel froze, it severed the primary economic artery for a Caribbean nation heavily reliant on tourism and international service sectors.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
The shock was profound, yet the data shows they rebounded back to over $29,000 by 2023. They took the hit, and their underlying economic infrastructure held.
So the wealth is resilient. But here's the piece of the data stack that forced me to, reread the spreadsheets.
Yeah.
We've established they have world-beating education. We've established they have an economy generating 43% more wealth per capita than the global average.
Right.
But their life expectancy in 2023 is 72.1 years. The world average is 73.4 years.
This raises an important question.
Yeah. If they have all this wealth and a population highly educated in health literacy, why is their life expectancy actually trailing the global average? It feels like a massive contradiction. High development usually correlates flawlessly with longer lives.
It does, but you are seeing the raw mechanics of population dynamics in a microstate during a crisis.
Okay, walk me through that.
Just like their economy took a massive hit during the pandemic, their public health system faced a disproportionate stress test. In 2019, right before the global shutdown, their life expectancy was fairly stable. But in 2021, the data shows a violent, brutal drop.
To what?
Life expectancy plummeted to 69.3 years.
Wow. Losing that much statistical life expectancy in a matter of months. Every country suffered during that period, obviously. But a drop that steep in a population of 50,000 means the impact is mathematically magnified. A handful of excess deaths violently skews the national average downward in a way that, a population of 300 million can statistically absorb.
That is the tragic math of a small sample size. A global health crisis hits their averages with a sledgehammer. But you cannot judge a healthcare system solely by how far it falls during a once-in-a-century crisis.
You have to measure the bounce back.
You have to measure the velocity of its recovery. By 2023, just 2 years after that devastating low, their life expectancy rebounded to 72.1 years. It's a sharp V-shaped recovery in public health.
It proves the underlying infrastructure funded by that $29,000 GNI and managed by that hyper-educated workforce possess the operational capacity to stop the bleeding and reverse the trend faster than many larger nations.
They are still slightly trailing the global average in sheer chronological longevity, but the speed of that recovery validates the resilience of their societal model.
We've spent a lot of time looking at averages today. We have high average wealth, rebounding average health, off-the-charts average education. But averages are notoriously deceptive, aren't they?
Oh,
You
absolutely.
could have a town of 10 people where one person makes $10 million and the other 9 are destitute, and the average makes them all look like millionaires.
The Bill Gates walks into a bar analogy.
Right. High development metrics mean absolutely nothing if only the top 1% of the island is actually experiencing them. So, how fair is this society under the hood?
Well, the UN data anticipates this exact problem. They provide a metric called the Inequality-Adjusted HDI, or IHDI.
Right.
It essentially measures the loss of human development due to inequality across the population. It penalizes a country's score based on how poorly its resources are distributed.
So think of national development like a massive electrical grid. You can generate a staggering amount of power at the source. That's your high average wealth, your advanced degrees, your top-tier hospitals. But the IHDI measures the resistance in the wires. If the infrastructure is highly unequal, if there are massive gaps between the rich and the poor, you lose massive amounts of that energy as heat before it ever reaches the homes on the edge of the grid.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. And globally, the power grid is wildly inefficient. According to the 2023 data, the world loses a staggering 21.96% of its total human development potential, strictly because of inequality.
Wow.
Nearly a quarter of global progress is lost in the wires.
Almost 22%. So how much resistance is in the grid of Saint Kitts and Nevis? Let's look specifically at the health inequality, since we just discussed their life expectancy trailing the global average.
When we isolate the inequality in life expectancy, St. Kitts and Nevis sits at only a 9.9% loss for 2023.
9.9%.
Yeah, and the world average for health inequality loss is almost 13%. 12.9 to be exact.
9.9% versus nearly 13%. What is the practical reality of that gap for someone living there?
Mechanically, it means that access to life-prolonging health care, preventative medicine, safe living conditions, and nutritional security is distributed far more evenly across those 50,000 citizens than it is in the vast majority of the world.
Okay.
Even if their absolute upper limit of life expectancy is slightly lower than the global average, the certainty of the average citizen actually reaching that age is much higher.
I see.
You don't have a polarized system where ultra-wealthy elites live into their 90s while marginalized communities die in their 50s. The health outcomes are compressed toward the middle in a highly egalitarian way.
They are raising the baseline of survival for everyone rather than just raising the ceiling for the privileged few.
Which perfectly loops back to the education data we started with. When you engineer a society where almost everyone, and crucially, almost every woman is spending nearly 2 decades in the education system, you naturally destroy the foundations of extreme inequality.
Right, because education is the great equalizer of income potential and health literacy.
Exactly. A highly educated population demands better civic infrastructure and knows how to access public health resources more effectively.
It is an incredibly cohesive system. The 18.5 years of expected schooling feeds the highly specialized workforce, which generates the $29,000 GNI per capita, which builds the hospitals and social safety nets that ensure only a 9.9% inequality loss in health.
It's all connected.
On paper, it looks like a masterclass in societal engineering, but we live in the 21st century, and modern development is never free. It comes with an environmental receipt.
The planetary cost.
Yeah.
You cannot achieve a very high human development index without a massive expenditure of energy.
The UN measures this using the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, the PHDI. This metric actively penalizes a country's development score based on its carbon footprint and its material consumption.
And the data here exposes the ultimate existential paradox of this island nation. St. Kitts and Nevis is achieving these incredible milestones in human capital, but maintaining that high-functioning service-based society requires continuous electricity generation, heavy reliance on imported goods, advanced cooling systems, modern transportation.
Right.
Their CO2 emissions per capita, based on production, sit at 4.889 tons for 2023.
Almost 5 tons. So how does almost 5 tons of carbon per person compare to the rest of the planet?
The global average for 2023 is roughly 4.536 tons. So St. Kitts and Nevis is actually emitting slightly more carbon per person than the global average.
Okay.
And if we look at their historical trajectory, their per capita emissions have roughly doubled since 1990, when it was around 2.6 tons.
I have to challenge the utility of this metric for a country this small, though. Are we really going to penalize a nation of 50,000 people for planetary pressure?
I hear you.
Even if their per capita rate is slightly higher than average, their absolute total carbon footprint is a microscopic drop in the ocean compared to the massive industrial output of global superpowers. It feels incredibly unfair to scrutinize their emissions when they are barely a rounding error on the global climate radar. Why penalize them for simply surviving and providing a good life for their citizens?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the PHDI metric isn't about assigning moral blame for global warming. You are entirely correct that their absolute emissions are not driving the melting of the ice caps.
Right.
But the metric is crucial because it forces us to ask a terrifying systemic question. Is this specific model of human development actually scalable?
Scalable. You mean what happens if the rest of the planet tries to replicate their success?
Exactly. If the whole world, all 8 billion of us, adopted the exact same energy and consumption mechanisms of St. Kitts and Nevis to reach that highly desirable HDI of 0.840, the planetary pressures would be mathematically catastrophic.
Wow.
We see this mirrored in the global material footprint data as well.
Oh, the material footprint. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, global consumption is drastically outpacing the growth of actual human development. Globally, the per capita material footprint has climbed from 8.67 tons in 1990 to 12.71 tons in 2023.
That's a huge jump in consumption.
It's an increase of nearly 47%. The model of progress we currently use, even the highly refined version used by Saint Kitts and Nevis, is fundamentally coupled to carbon-intensive energy and massive material consumption.
And that highlights the bitter irony of their situation. They have built this incredible, highly educated, egalitarian society, but they rely on an energy model that produces higher than average carbon emissions.
Yeah.
And because they are a low-lying Caribbean island nation, they are sitting on the literal front lines of the climate crisis. They are infinitely more vulnerable to the rising sea levels, the warming oceans, the intensified hurricanes caused by the very carbon-intensive development model they and the entire developed world are forced to use.
It is a profound systemic vulnerability. They are undeniably winning the complex game of human development, but they are playing that game on a game board that is slowly shrinking due to ecological pressures.
Right.
The next great hurdle for St. Kitts and Nevis, and frankly for the world, won't just be extending education or growing the economy. It will be the agonizing process of decoupling that high human development from carbon emissions.
As we bring all these diverse threads together, we have unpacked an incredibly dense, fascinating narrative from this data stack.
We really have.
St. Kitts and Nevis proves, definitively, that a microeconomy can engineer a macro impact on the lives of its citizens. They didn't strike oil, they didn't conquer a continent, they simply invested relentlessly, almost aggressively, in the human mind.
By engineering a massive 5.5-year educational advantage over the rest of the world, and specifically empowering their women to push for nearly 20 expected years of schooling, they constructed a high-income, highly resilient society.
And critically, a society that distributes its health outcomes far more fairly than the global average, proving it can absorb massive systemic shocks, like a global pandemic, and rebound with astonishing velocity.
Yeah, their V-shaped recovery is a testament to that.
It is a massive leap across the ocean of statistical averages, landing them comfortably in the top 30% of the world. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to really mull over, a question about the nature of scale itself.
Okay.
We are conditioned to assume that massive countries, nations with sprawling tax bases, endless natural resources, and hundreds of millions of citizens have the ultimate optimized blueprint for human development. We assume that bigger is inherently better equipped to provide a high quality of life.
Right, the economies of scale argument.
Exactly. But if a geographically isolated island of 50,000 people, a population smaller than a typical suburban town, can deliberately engineer this kind of societal leap, largely by overinvesting in its classrooms and aggressively empowering its women. What is the excuse for the world's global superpowers?
That's a great question.
Does massive scale actually breed inefficiency? Does managing hundreds of millions of people inherently create apathy and logistical friction in caring for human lives?
That's entirely possible.
Maybe the nation-state model of the 20th century, the massive, sprawling empire, is actually detrimental to the localized, highly targeted investments required to truly elevate human development. It's something to think about the next time you look at a world map and your eyes pass right over the tiny dots in the ocean to focus on the giants. Maybe the real giants, the ones holding the actual blueprint for our future, are the ones we're barely looking at.